Hello, my name is Javier Dinsa, and you're watching HD Books. Today, I am talking about The Three Body Problem, an excellent book, and I'm very excited to do this video. Okay, so as the title of this video suggests, I am going to be doing a deep dive into the physics of the three body problem, this book, but in a follow up video to this one. So I'm going to briefly discuss, with spoilers, for about a minute or so, what I am going to be going into in that follow up video. But the rest of this video is going to be dedicated to a similar style review as with Hyperion. So going over various storytelling aspects, including world building, plot, characters, impact, themes, and writing style. So a little bit of a spoiler warning for just about a minute with timestamps below, and as well as a timestamp for the numerical score at the very end here. So if you're in a hurry, you can check that out as well. So I will, of course, be citing all my sources, and if you want to check that out, you can look at various papers and so on. And I will incorporate a fair amount of sort of popular science articles as well as more detailed technical articles if you wish to look at that. Now, all the way from the quite literally the cutting edge nanomaterials, which come into play with the plot later on, that were introduced to quite early in the book by Wang Mao. So I will say this now, I'm likely going to butcher a lot of these names, and I'm going to try my best though with all of them. All the way to the points about information theory and the three body problem, the game itself, the virtual reality. So talking about that, which is a mix, right, of physics, computer science, other things. Not really just a physics problem. Then the three body problem itself. So the chaotic dynamics that arise from dealing with that, the use cases that were hinted in this book, where you have something that's solvable analytically completely, when you can consider certain things negligible, or you can ignore certain things and deal with a two body problem. And then the ramifications from a stellar system being set up in this way. So, all very interesting ideas and definitely things I will be looking at. And then, as well as the logistics of the human computer that comes up. Again, that's more of a logistics problem, not really a physics problem, but we can talk about that. And then a big chunk of the book is devoted to the idea of unfolding the proton into higher dimensional space-time. A bunch of three types of physics in this book. There's what I would call hard physics, basically solidified laws, theories that are well-founded, things like that. So hard physics, there's quite a bit of that. There's also quite a bit of speculative physics, which would be where the unfolding of the proton and talking about higher dimensions of space-time, where all of that would fall into that speculative regime. And then there's also quite a bit of metaphysics in here, where you're sort of treating the abstract problems that come about in your physical space, your physical reality, from a more ethereal standpoint. So there's quite a bit of all three of those areas in this book. And I really want to go into all of those in that deep dive I'm going to be making. So I look forward to making that. It's going to take a little bit of time to get together because I want to make sure I cite my sources and everything like that. What is the three body problem about? Really quick here in a spoiler-free way. Wang Mao, who is a nanomaterials researcher, he begins to look at various aspects of the world and find that they're behaving in a very strange way, in a way that he cannot explain with scientific thought, with physical reasoning. And they start out a little bit more mundane, but still strange. And he consults his other past colleagues, professors of physics. One of the very first things he notices, and this is not a spoiler because it's just so early on in the book, is that his hobby is he's a photographer as a hobby, and every time he takes a photo, regardless of how he takes it, a countdown clock shows up in the printout of his photograph, and there's a little ticker there basically, and it's counting down, and it's keeping track of how much time has elapsed between photographs, and he cannot explain this away with any sort of physical reasoning. This goes on to even more sort of grand, weird things going on with the world that you cannot explain easily. This is basically the setup of the mystery, and there is a a game that he finds out about called the three body problem, and he quickly realizes that it's not your typical virtual reality game. It's quite a bit more significant than that. In what ways, he's not sure. There's another faction called the Frontiers of Science that is involved with tackling basically very fundamental problems and thinking about how we think and how we tackle scientific problems. And through this sequence of events where random things are happening, things that you cannot understand based on our physical theories, a number of physicists, either close to our protagonist or tangentially related or that he knows of, start to go, some of them go insane or just give up on their work entirely, become depressed, and for reasons that in some ways are unknown, in some ways are starting to get pieced together a little bit. So that is our whole conspiracy setup, and I just love the premise already, and it really kind of grabbed me from really this, I would say, the fourth or fifth chapter, as soon as the first really strange phenomenon started. So yeah, that is the basic premise of the three body problem. Now we move on to the actual review here. So with world building first, right? The setup of this story is really a mystery. It's not only a mystery, it's rather a haunting one. What I really like about this book is that there is a ton of historical backdrop here with, based on my rudimentary, understanding. I have not gone into the actual histories much beyond this, right? Or at all, with this particular time period in China. So take what I say here with a grain of salt, but I like the historical backdrop with the transition period, basically, of various factions coming about in China, communist ideals, as well as championing the people as opposed to certain authority figures, and it's sort of a more dictatorship or emperor type dynasty regime, right? So moving away from that to an extreme basically is what the first little bit of this book is about, and to a more open society. However, as you quickly realize, it's not quite so simple. But I really like the historical backdrop here. There's also a ton of footnotes in this book that refer to either real papers or to real, um, events in history that actually took place, and a little bit of the facts and figures with that. So I really like that aspect of this book. I like mixing the fiction with the nonfiction, the technical detail, even the speculative parts in this book. So not only the hard physics, but also the more speculative physics and so forth is done really well, and it's sort of weaved into the narrative really well in a very interesting way. And now, as I was saying, the mix of real world people, politics, religion with fictional elements. So there's a ton of crossover here of talking about real world physicists and scientists and philosophers, and sort of injecting them into the narrative in very interesting ways. The world building absolutely drew me in. Of course, I probably do have some bias here, as my field of study, my future career trajectory really is all to do with physics, and a chunk of this book, really all of it, has to do with physics. and has fundamental problems and questions rooted in physics. So I do have some bias there, but you know, it is what it is, and I can say that what I have read, even aside from the technical details, gives that world building a perfect score in my opinion. Absolutely fantastic. Moving forward to the plot here. Now, some criticisms of the plot here. So there's a standoff between various factions that have developed later on in the story, and it feels um, very odd how it's resolved. And that really has to do with the pacing. So there's inconsistent pacing here, I have found, and particularly with that standoff sequence, it seems that a lot of things are sort of taken care of in a way that not only you wouldn't expect that also, but also are very jarring, I think, sometimes, just because of how quickly they're sort of swept under the rug and then the next big idea is thrown at you. So there are a ton of awesome concepts thrown at you in this book. That's really the strength here, I would say. But more on that later. But there's no shortage of that. However, the times it chose to be a bit inconsistent really, I think, took me out of what was happening, and I sort of had to think to myself, and almost to the point of convincing myself, like, okay, so that wasn't too ridiculous, and I tried to rationalize it to myself. But of course, when you're trying to do that with a narrative, it's not a good sign. So a couple of things there that I'm not happy about with the plot. However, the unveiling of the entire sort of conspiracy in this book, in the first half of this book, and the mystery that surrounds it, as I was alluding to earlier, among other things, is done very well, and it's all very tight, and there is no logical gap anywhere that I could tell. Um, Again, this is beyond the technical detail and just the narrative structure itself. As far as I could tell, look, there was no other logical gaps, and that's always a great thing. While I do have some criticisms of the plot, it still scores very highly because of what it does well. So I will give the plot here a 5 out of 6. Now, characters. This is where a few points are taken off here. So the characters here are sufficient and the arcs make sense. However, the character moments that identify character traits and solidify them are lessened. They're there, so you understand these are the character traits, and you understand why their certain characters act the way they do. However, it's not really exposed well, and it's also not reinforced well later on in the story. Even towards the end, as you have a lot of particular decisions made that are kind of rely on you understanding who the characters are, those all land. So you understand what's going on. However, the lack of dialogue here, I think, is really the lack of dialogue and monologues is really, I think, the culprit here. Now, this is all sort of a Western ideal for storytelling, I think. I have read a number of Eastern storytelling focused, novels before. However, my thinking is very Western influenced, and so maybe the characters are great. I've heard many fantastic writers say how no, the characters are actually great, and then others saying that oh no, the characters were what sort of brought the book down for me. So, in my opinion, the lack of dialogue and monologues kind of bring this down quite a bit, in my opinion, because nearly all the prose is dedicated to delivering information in a very sort of matter of fact way, and it's not character focused. A couple characters that add some levity, some comedic relief, right, but while not being undermined or ignored. So comedic relief, but also smart characters that can definitely add to the story when it's called for, right? So a couple of great characters. However, that lack of dialogue, those sequences, that really makes it so this aspect will not stick with me. I see this kind of vanishing in the back of my mind pretty soon. The characters here, characters, I give a solid 3 out of 6. Emotional impact. Now, I love all the physics and the thought experiments done here. There's a one particular thought experiment which is very interesting, and I'll just say the name of it. It's called The Shooter and the Farmer, and it's sort of a view of how humanity looks around them and tries to understand the world, tries to understand the universe. So I thought all of that was great. The ideas here are very powerful, and they definitely stick in my head. Now, a lot of the speculative physics I am familiar with, so I have encountered those a number of times before. However, there was a ton of new concepts in here, very imaginative, awesome concepts that really solidified my thinking with, will this book stick with me or not? Another really cool thing that this book sort of gave me hope for is a new angle for writing that really combines technical scientific writing and even those footnotes were linking or citing specific papers and then weaving that in with a fictional narrative. I didn't realize to the extent that it really could be done successfully, but this book is a very clear example of how that can be done. And so that makes me excited because I think maybe one day, after being more well read in this genre and also in fantasy, really, impact score as a 6 out of 6 for me. Fantastic. I have no doubt that the longevity for this book will be with me for a while. The themes we're dealing with: what is the nature of the world, the nature of the universe, physics at the most fundamental level. Um, so actually, my area of research in physics in grad school is to do with some of the concepts that are highlighted really at the beginning of this novel and sort of throughout, expanding more on that with sort of the most fundamental you can get with particles you're working with. Right up my alley. So the themes were a perfect 3 out of 3 for me. Another thing to note here, the themes, without getting into spoilers, right? The evolution of civilization and multiple lens perspectives and multiple ways of thinking about it. Um, that's always something I really look forward to reading about, whether it be nonfiction or fiction. And finally, with writing style. Now, here I think that some changes to the prose could make for, especially at the beginning, toward the first third of this novel, some powerful emotional moments and some haunting, eerie moments, as I was talking about earlier in the review. However, the prose here is not exceptional in that it really draws you in to that angle. It's sort of more of it's more the information, the concept that leaves you with that feeling. But I think the prose could do more to reinforce that. And an example here is I have, if it was written in a similar style as Hyperion, where Dan Simmons has mystery, intrigue, a horror-like curiosity and draw just nailed down so perfectly in that, I think that would be really, really fantastic in the three body problem. Unfortunately, we don't really have that, but it's still written in a very cool way because there's a lot of that blending I was talking about before um, with citations and historical footnotes and so forth, as well as sort of breakups in the chapters with sort of a reading like an instruction manual and then getting back into the narrative and then getting into some of the characters' thoughts, which happens briefly and not often, but it does happen. So I think all of these things working together, that's a great recipe for me. I've found it might not sound interesting to read like an instruction manual or a summarization of some technical document within the narrative. But I thought it was fantastic. I love those breaks. And so that's why the writing style I will give a 2 out of 3. Okay, so with all that being said, a visualization of the scores I will give here. So we have the world building, plot, characters, impact here. And then we have the themes and writing style here. And finally, the total for the three body problem is shown here. So a 25 out of 30, an excellent book. Maybe not quite as good as Hyperion, but for the concepts that were delivered here, I am more than excited to get into the Dark Forest, and I'm sure I'll have a lot to say about that as well. Hopefully you look forward to that deep dive that we'll be doing. If you have any specifics that you'd like to recommend for that, I'm all ears. You're watching HD Books. My name is Harvey Ardinsa, and I will see you next time.